November 14, 1944. The transport truck rattled through the dusty roads of West Texas, carrying its cargo of exhausted women toward an uncertain fate. Inside, 28 German prisoners of war sat in tense silence, their bodies swaying with each bump and turn. They wore the remnants of their Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, now stained and torn from weeks of travel across the Atlantic and through American processing centers. Their faces reflected a mixture of fear, defiance, and something else that none of them wanted to admit: hunger so profound it had become a constant companion. 23-year-old Marlene Weber pressed her palm against her stomach, trying to quiet the growling that had become almost embarrassing in its persistence. She hadn't eaten a full meal in over 6 weeks, not since her capture near the French border. The processing centers had provided minimal rations, just enough to keep prisoners alive, but never enough to satisfy. She had lost count of how many times she had dreamed of her mother's potato soup, simple and thin as it was. Even that meager dish from her childhood seemed like a feast compared to the watery broth and hard bread that had sustained her through captivity. Beside her, Greta Hoffman stared out the small window at the passing landscape. The vastness of Texas overwhelmed her, endless plains stretching toward horizons that seemed impossibly distant. Everything about America felt oversized and strange. The German women had been told many things about their enemy during their service to the Reich. They had been assured that Americans were soft, decadent, and cruel to their prisoners. They had been warned to expect harsh treatment, torture perhaps, and certainly starvation as revenge for Germany's actions in occupied territories. The truck slowed, and through the dust-covered window, Marlene caught her first glimpse of their destination. Camp Swift sat on the outskirts of Bastrop, Texas, a sprawling facility that had been hastily converted to house the unexpected influx of German women prisoners. Unlike the massive camps holding male POWs, this smaller compound held fewer than 50 women, all captured in various support roles for the Wehrmacht. Radio operators, nurses, administrative clerks, young women who had believed they were serving their country's defense, now facing the consequences of that choice in a foreign land they had been taught to hate. As the truck came to a complete stop, an American officer appeared at the rear gate. Captain Robert Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China decades earlier, looked at the frightened faces before him with an expression that surprised Marlene. It wasn't hatred or disgust. It was something closer to pity. He spoke in careful, slow English, assuming correctly that few of them would understand. His words were translated by a stern-faced woman in American uniform, Lieutenant Sarah Mueller, whose German carried the accent of someone who had left the country long before the war began. "Welcome to Camp Swift," the translation came. "You will be processed, assigned quarters, and then taken to the mess hall for your evening meal." Evening meal. The words hung in the air like an impossible promise. Marlene exchanged glances with Greta, seeing her own desperate hope reflected back. The mess hall doors swung open, and Marlene stopped so abruptly that Greta nearly collided with her from behind. The smell hit them first, rich, savory, complex in ways that seemed almost offensive after weeks of bland deprivation. Her eyes struggled to process what she was seeing. Long tables filled the room, and at the far end, American soldiers moved through a serving line, their trays piled high with food that steamed in the cool evening air. Captain Chen gestured for the German women to form a line. They moved hesitantly, their military training warring with their confusion and suspicion. Marlene found herself at the front, facing a large black man in kitchen whites who smiled at her with genuine warmth. Sergeant James Martinez, whose family had been cooking in Texas for 3 generations, had volunteered for this assignment specifically because he understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy in your own country. He placed a large square of golden cornbread on her tray, then ladled an enormous portion of the dark red chili beside it. Steam rose from the bowl, carrying scents of cumin, chili peppers, and slow-cooked beef. He added a glass of fresh milk, white and cold, then pointed to the butter on the table. Marlene stood frozen, staring at her tray as if it contained something dangerous. This had to be a trick. This much food, this quality, it was impossible. Perhaps it was poisoned. Perhaps it was a cruel joke before they received their real rations. She carried her tray to a table where other German women were gathering, each wearing the same expression of disbelief. Greta sat down with her own overflowing tray and whispered in rapid German, "This cannot be real. This must be for the guards, and they gave it to us by mistake." Another woman, Anna Schumacher, who had served as a communications specialist, pointed with her fork at the American soldiers eating at nearby tables. Their portions were identical to what the German prisoners had received. Same cornbread, same chili, same milk. Marlene picked up her fork with trembling fingers. She broke off a small piece of cornbread, the golden crust crumbling under the pressure. It was still warm. She brought it to her mouth, and the taste exploded across her tongue, slightly sweet, rich with butter, with a texture both crispy and soft. She closed her eyes as her body responded to real food after so long. The chili came next, and she had to suppress a small sound at the complexity of flavors. Meat, real beef, beans, tomatoes, spices she couldn't identify. It was rich and filling in a way she had almost forgotten food could be. Around her, the other women ate in silence, but tears were flowing freely down several faces. These weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of confusion, of cognitive dissonance so profound it physically hurt. Everything they had been told about Americans, about how prisoners would be treated, about the righteousness of their cause, all of it was crumbling with each bite of cornbread. Marlene couldn't stop eating, even as tears streamed down her face. Her hands moved mechanically, breaking off pieces of cornbread, spooning chili into her mouth, but her mind had traveled back to Berlin in the winter of 1943. She could see her mother's kitchen, cold and dim, rationing cards spread across the scarred wooden table. Her younger brother Klaus, only 8 years old then, crying because there wasn't enough bread to satisfy his hunger. Her mother dividing one small potato among 4 people, making soup from bones that had already been boiled 3 times before. She remembered the pride she had felt joining the Women's Auxiliary Corps. The recruiter had promised that her service would help ensure that German families would never go hungry, that the Reich was fighting to secure resources and living space for the German people. She had believed that the sacrifices at home were necessary, that their enemies were responsible for the deprivation her family endured. Now she sat in an enemy camp, eating better than she had eaten in 3 years, while her propaganda-fed assumptions dissolved like sugar in hot coffee. Greta noticed Marlene's tears and reached across the table to grip her hand. Greta's own face was wet, her eyes red. "My sister wrote me last spring," she whispered in German, her voice breaking. She said, "They were eating tulip bulbs, Marlene, and we are here eating this." She gestured helplessly at her tray, at the abundance that seemed to mock everything they had been told about their enemies and their cause. Other women at the table were having similar moments of reckoning. Anna Schumacher had stopped eating altogether, staring at her half-finished meal with an expression of such profound confusion that it bordered on pain. Elsa Koch, who had lost her husband at Stalingrad, was eating with desperate intensity, as if she could consume enough food to fill the void his death had left. Frieda Zimmermann kept touching the glass of milk, running her finger along the condensation, unable to believe that such luxury was being offered to prisoners. Sergeant Martinez watched from the serving line, his heart breaking for these young women who were clearly wrestling with something deeper than simple hunger. He had seen many prisoners pass through this mess hall over the past year, but he had never witnessed anything quite like this. Most male prisoners ate with sullen resignation or forced gratitude. These women ate like people whose entire worldview was collapsing with every bite. Lieutenant Mueller stood near the wall, observing with clinical detachment. She had left Germany in 1933, seeing what was coming before most of her countrymen understood the danger. She felt no sympathy for these women who had served the Reich, but she recognized the cognitive dissonance playing out before her. She had experienced her own version of it when she first came to America and discovered that everything she had been taught about this country was filtered through European prejudice and ignorance. Sergeant James Martinez had learned about prejudice long before he ever put on an American uniform. His grandfather had come to Texas from Mexico in 1898, following work and opportunity across a border that felt more fluid then. His father had been born in San Antonio, making James a second-generation American, but that hadn't stopped the suspicious looks, the comments about his loyalty, or the questions about whether Mexicans could really be trusted to serve in the American military. He had volunteered for kitchen duty at Camp Swift specifically because he understood what it meant to be judged before you opened your mouth. He had watched the German women file into his mess hall that first night, seeing not enemies, but frightened young people far from home, caught up in forces larger than themselves. He recognized the fear in their eyes because he had seen similar fear in the eyes of Japanese-American families being loaded onto buses headed for internment camps 2 years earlier. The morning after that first dinner, Martinez arrived at the kitchen before dawn to begin preparing breakfast. He made his biscuits from scratch, cutting cold butter into flour with practiced efficiency. He fried eggs, made gravy, and prepared grits the way his grandmother had taught him. When the German women filed in for their first breakfast, he watched their faces carefully, trying to gauge their reactions to foods that would be even more foreign to them than dinner had been. Marlene approached the serving line with visible hesitation. Martinez smiled at her and held up a biscuit. "Biscuit," he said slowly, pointing to it. "Biscuit." She repeated the word carefully, her German accent making it sound like Biscuit. He nodded encouragingly and placed 2 on her plate. He pointed to the gravy. "Gravy, gravy." Again she repeated it, and he ladled a generous portion over her biscuits. He showed her the eggs, the grits, explaining each item in simple English, speaking slowly enough that she could begin to associate words with food. By the 3rd day, other women had joined this informal language lesson during meal service. Greta learned the word for milk. Anna mastered coffee. Elsa could identify bacon, eggs, and toast. Martinez realized he was teaching them more than vocabulary. He was teaching them that Americans could be patient, kind, and genuinely interested in helping them understand this strange new world they found themselves in. He began bringing recipe cards to meals, showing them pictures and ingredients for traditional American dishes. The women crowded around these cards with surprising enthusiasm, pointing and asking questions in broken English. Food, Martinez understood, was becoming a bridge between 2 worlds. It was concrete and immediate in ways that politics and ideology could never be. You couldn't argue with the taste of good cornbread or the comfort of hot chili on a cold night. By the end of their first week at Camp Swift, the German women had developed an unexpected routine. Mealtimes became the center of their daily existence, not just for the food itself, but for the strange sense of normalcy that accompanied them. Marlene found herself arriving at the mess hall early, helping Sergeant Martinez set up tables and learning the English names for utensils, plates, and serving dishes. Fork, spoon, knife, bowl. Each word felt like a small victory over the confusion that had defined her first days in captivity. Martinez noticed her aptitude for language and began expanding his lessons beyond simple vocabulary. He taught her phrases that would help in the kitchen. "Please pass the salt." "May I have more water?" "Thank you very much." His patient repetition and gentle corrections made learning feel safe rather than threatening. Marlene discovered she had a talent for mimicking sounds, and her pronunciation improved rapidly. Other women began asking her to translate, creating an informal hierarchy where Marlene became the bridge between German prisoners and American staff. The food itself continued to astonish them. Martinez rotated through a variety of traditional Texas dishes, each one revealing new dimensions of American abundance. On Monday, they ate chicken fried steak with cream gravy. On Tuesday, barbecued brisket with coleslaw and potato salad. Wednesday brought fried catfish with hush puppies. Thursday featured pork chops with black-eyed peas and collard greens. Each meal came with cornbread, that golden constant that had become a symbol of their transformed circumstances. Greta, who had worked in a Berlin office before the war, began keeping a small notebook where she sketched the meals and wrote down the English words Martinez taught them. Her drawings were surprisingly detailed, showing the arrangement of food on plates, the textures of different dishes, the way steam rose from hot bowls. She labeled everything in both German and English, creating a visual dictionary of their culinary education. Other women borrowed her notebook to study, treating it like a sacred text that might help them decode the mysteries of American culture. The transformation wasn't just linguistic or culinary. Something deeper was happening to the women's relationship with their captors. Private Wilson, a young guard from Oklahoma, had started joining Martinez during the informal language lessons. He taught them the English words for weather, for animals they saw around camp, for emotions: happy, sad, confused, grateful. That last word became particularly important: grateful. The women practiced saying it, understanding that it described the complicated feeling that was growing inside them. Anna Schumacher, always the most analytical of the group, voiced what others were thinking during their evening meal on the 10th day. She spoke in German, but her words carried weight that transcended language. They are not treating us like prisoners. They are treating us like guests who will eventually leave, but also like students they hope will learn something important while they are here. She paused, stirring her chili thoughtfully. I think perhaps we are learning something we were never supposed to know, that our enemies are not actually our enemies at all. December 24, 1944, arrived with unseasonably cold weather for Central Texas. The German women had been at Camp Swift for 6 weeks, and Christmas approached with a mixture of homesickness and anticipation that surprised them all. Marlene had written to her family in Berlin, but had received no response. Mail from Germany was sporadic at best, and she tried not to imagine the worst. Instead, she focused on the present moment, on the unexpected community she had found in this strange place. Captain Chen had been planning the Christmas celebration for weeks, consulting with Martinez about the menu and with Lieutenant Muller about appropriate ways to acknowledge the German prisoners' own traditions. The result was a feast that would have seemed impossible in wartime Europe. The mess hall had been decorated with pine branches cut from nearby trees, their fresh scent filling the room. Red ribbons, donated by local churches, added color to the military gray and green of the camp's usual aesthetic. When the women entered the mess hall on Christmas Eve, they stopped collectively at the doorway. The tables had been arranged in a large square, and in the center sat a feast unlike anything they had seen even in their first days at camp. 2 massive turkeys, golden brown and glistening, ham studded with cloves and glazed with honey, cornbread dressing made with sage and onions, sweet potato casserole topped with pecans, green beans cooked with bacon, mashed potatoes with butter pooling in the center, cranberry sauce, rolls, and in the middle of it all, 3 pecan pies that Martinez had spent the afternoon perfecting. Greta grabbed Marlene's arm so tightly it hurt. "This is not real," she whispered in German. "This cannot be real." But it was real, and as Captain Chen invited them to sit, explaining through Lieutenant Muller that this was a traditional American Christmas dinner, the women took their places with trembling hands. American soldiers sat among them, not as guards but as fellow diners, passing dishes and serving food with the casual ease of a family gathering. Martinez had taught Marlene enough English that she could understand Captain Chen's brief speech before the meal. "Christmas is about hope," he said simply. "Hope that even in the darkest times there is light. Hope that enemies can become friends. Hope that tomorrow can be better than today." His words were translated, but Marlene understood them before Lieutenant Muller finished speaking. The meal was eaten in relative silence, but it wasn't the tense silence of their first dinner. It was the silence of people overwhelmed by sensory experience and emotional complexity. Frieda Zimmerman wept quietly into her napkin, remembering the last Christmas she had spent with her husband before Stalingrad. Elsa Koch savored each bite of turkey as if committing the taste to permanent memory. Anna Schumacher found herself sitting next to Private Wilson, and they attempted conversation in their shared broken language, laughing at misunderstandings and finding connection despite the barriers. 3 days after Christmas, Marlene approached Sergeant Martinez with a proposal that had been forming in her mind for weeks. She spoke in her careful English, choosing words slowly. "Sergeant Martinez, may I ask you something? You teach us American food. Can we teach you German food?" Martinez looked at her thoughtfully, recognizing the significance of her request. This wasn't just about cooking. It was about dignity, reciprocity, and the need to contribute rather than simply receive. He brought her proposal to Captain Chen, who immediately grasped its potential. Within a week, arrangements had been made. The German women would be allowed supervised access to the kitchen during afternoon hours when regular meal preparation was complete. They could requisition ingredients within reasonable limits, and they would teach the American staff to prepare traditional German dishes. The cultural exchange that had begun with Martinez's informal English lessons would now flow in both directions. The first lesson took place on January 5, 1945. Marlene, Greta, Anna, and Elsa stood in the kitchen alongside Martinez, Private Wilson, and 2 other American soldiers who had volunteered to learn. Marlene had chosen to teach them Kartoffelpuffer, potato pancakes, because the ingredients were readily available and the dish was simple enough to master in one session. She demonstrated grating potatoes, mixing them with eggs and flour, forming the mixture into patties, and frying them until golden brown. Martinez watched her hands move with practiced confidence, seeing a different person emerge from the frightened prisoner who had arrived 2 months earlier. Here in the kitchen, teaching something she knew well, Marlene carried herself with quiet authority. She corrected Private Wilson's technique gently, showed him how to judge when the oil was hot enough, explained why the potatoes needed to be squeezed dry before mixing. Her English flowed more naturally when discussing something familiar. And Martinez noted how teaching seemed to unlock linguistic abilities that stress had kept hidden. The Kartoffelpuffer were served with applesauce at dinner that evening, alongside the regular meal. American soldiers tried them with curiosity, many going back for seconds. The German women ate them with expressions of such profound nostalgia that several guards looked away, uncomfortable witnessing such raw emotion. For Greta, these simple potato pancakes tasted like her grandmother's kitchen in Munich. For Anna, they recalled Sunday breakfasts before the war. For Marlene, they were a connection to a life that felt increasingly distant and increasingly questionable. The cooking lessons became a regular feature of camp life. Each week, different women taught different dishes. Spätzle, those small egg noodles that were a staple of southern German cooking. Sauerbraten, though Martinez had to substitute ingredients to approximate the traditional preparation. Stollen, the Christmas bread that they made in January because the holiday itself had been too overwhelming. Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte Black Forest cake, which required Martinez to special order cherries and chocolate. February brought the first letters from Germany, arriving in batches that had been delayed by winter storms and the chaos of war. Lieutenant Muller distributed them during evening formation, calling out names in alphabetical order. Marlene's name was called third. She accepted the thin envelope with shaking hands, recognizing her mother's careful handwriting on the front. The postmark was dated December 8, 1944, nearly 2 months earlier. She waited until she was alone in her bunk to open it. The letter was short, written on paper so thin she could see through it to the words on the other side. Her mother's usually neat script was cramped and uneven, as if written by someone whose hand trembled with cold or hunger or both. Marlene read the German words slowly, each sentence landing like a physical blow. Her father had been killed in an Allied bombing raid in November. Her brother Klaus, now 10 years old, had been evacuated to the countryside with other children. Her mother was living in the basement of their bombed apartment building with 3 other families, sharing one room and whatever food they could obtain through increasingly worthless ration cards. The most devastating paragraph came near the end. "We are eating things I never imagined we would eat. Potato peels, grass soup. Yesterday, Frau Müller boiled leather scraps from an old boot to make something that resembled broth. Klaus cries from hunger when he visits. I have nothing to give him, nothing. And I think of you, my darling daughter, and I pray that wherever you are being treated mercifully. I pray that you have food. I pray that you are alive." Marlene sat on her bunk holding the letter, unable to cry, unable to move. She had just eaten dinner, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, cornbread, apple pie. She had eaten until she was satisfied, even comfortable full. And then she had taken a second piece of cornbread because Martinez always encouraged them to eat as much as they wanted. While she was eating second helpings of American abundance, her mother was boiling leather and her brother was crying from hunger. Greta received similar news. Her family in Hamburg had lost their home to fire bombs. Her sister, the one who had written about eating tulip bulbs, had disappeared. No one knew if she had been killed in the raids or had fled to the countryside or was simply lost in the chaos of refugees moving through destroyed cities. Anna's letter brought news that her younger brother had been conscripted at 16 and sent to the Eastern Front. He was now missing. Elsa learned that her parents had died during the winter, whether from bombing or starvation or disease. The letter didn't specify. That night, the German women gathered in their barracks and wept together. They wept for their families, for their country, for the impossible situation they found themselves in. They were safe. They were fed. They were warm. And that safety felt like a betrayal of everyone they loved who was suffering while they lived in enemy comfort. The cognitive dissonance that had begun with their first meal of cornbread and chili had now become a moral crisis that none of them knew how to resolve. The guilt transformed into frenzied activity. Marlene threw herself into kitchen work with an intensity that worried Martinez. She arrived before dawn and stayed until late evening, kneading bread, chopping vegetables, scrubbing pots until her hands were raw. The physical labor provided temporary relief from the mental anguish of knowing her family starved while she lived in abundance. If she worked hard enough, moved fast enough, perhaps she could earn the food she was eating. Perhaps she could transform undeserved mercy into something that resembled justice. Greta joined her in this desperate productivity. Together they reorganized the entire pantry, cataloging supplies, and creating inventory systems that impressed even the meticulous Captain Chen. They volunteered for every kitchen duty, every cleaning task, every project that needed hands and time. Anna took over the camp's mending, repairing uniforms and linens with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. Elsa, who had some medical training, began assisting the camp nurse, caring for minor injuries and illnesses with a gentleness that seemed to channel all her grief into healing. Martinez recognized what he was witnessing. These women were trying to atone through action, attempting to balance an equation that could never be balanced. He let them work, understanding that they needed this outlet, but he also watched carefully for signs that their guilt was becoming destructive. He noticed Marlene sometimes skipping meals, and he began insisting she eat at least a small portion before returning to work. He saw how Greta's hands trembled when she wrote letters home, and he quietly left extra paper and stamps where she could find them. The other American staff responded with surprising compassion. Private Wilson started bringing books to the barracks, understanding that the women needed distraction from their thoughts during evening hours. He taught them card games, simple ones at first, then more complex as their English improved. The games provided structure and social interaction that helped ease the isolation of guilt. Lieutenant Miller, despite her initial coldness, began conducting informal discussion groups where the women could talk about their feelings in German, processing their complicated emotions in their native language. Captain Chen instituted a new policy. The German women would be paid a small stipend for their kitchen work, following the Geneva Convention guidelines for prisoner labor. The amount was minimal, but the psychological impact was significant. They were no longer just recipients of American charity, they were workers earning compensation, contributing value, participating in an exchange rather than simply receiving handouts. Marlene carefully saved every cent, planning to send it to her mother when mail service improved, though she didn't know if such transfers would even be possible. The cooking lessons took on new meaning in this context. When the German women taught American dishes, they were giving something back, sharing knowledge and skills that had value. Greta spent hours with Martinez, teaching him the precise technique for making proper German bread, the kind with dense crumb and crispy crust. Anna showed Private Wilson how to make Rindsrouladen, beef rolls stuffed with bacon and pickles. These weren't just recipes, they were offerings, attempts to balance the scales of kindness that felt permanently tipped against them. Greta had filled 3 notebooks with her careful drawings and annotations by mid-February. Each page contained detailed sketches of meals, ingredient lists in both German and English, and notes about techniques and variations. She had documented every American dish they had learned and every German recipe they had taught. The notebooks had become precious objects, passed around the barracks each evening as women studied them like scripture, memorizing the words and images that represented their transformation. One evening, as Marlene paged through the most recent notebook, an idea struck her with sudden clarity. "Greta," she said in German, "these should be shared. Not just with us, but with everyone. Americans should know our food. We should remember theirs. This should be a real book." Greta looked up from her current drawing, a detailed rendering of Martinez's cornbread with annotations about baking temperature and the proper ratio of cornmeal to flour. She understood immediately what Marlene was suggesting, not just a collection of recipes, but a document of their journey from enemies to something else entirely. They brought the idea to Martinez, who brought it to Captain Chen. Within a week, they had permission and resources. The camp would help produce a formal recipe book combining German and American dishes, with proceeds from any sales going to support displaced persons' relief in Europe. It would be a project that gave purpose to their guilt and created something lasting from their unusual circumstances. The women threw themselves into the work with the same intensity they had brought to their kitchen labor. Marlene became the primary translator, converting German recipes into English and ensuring American recipes were accurately described in German. Her language skills had improved dramatically over 3 months, and she discovered she had a talent for finding English words that captured not just the literal meaning, but the emotional resonance of cooking terms. Greta expanded her drawings, creating full-page illustrations of finished dishes that were small works of art. Anna wrote introductions for each section, explaining the cultural significance of different foods and the traditions surrounding them. The recipe book became a community project. American soldiers contributed family recipes, wanting their mother's dishes represented alongside the German contributions. Private Wilson provided his grandmother's recipe for buttermilk biscuits. Another guard shared his wife's chocolate cake. Martinez contributed his own family's recipes for tamales and enchiladas, adding a third cultural dimension to the collection. The book was evolving into something larger than anyone had initially imagined, a document of how food transcends borders and creates connections between people who thought they had nothing in common. Lieutenant Muller helped with historical context, writing brief essays about the role of food in German culture before the war and about American cooking traditions. She provided perspective that neither the prisoners nor the guards could offer, having lived in both worlds and understood both deeply. Her contribution gave the book intellectual weight alongside its practical recipes and beautiful illustrations, transforming it from a simple cookbook into a meditation on culture, conflict, and reconciliation. March brought warmer weather and an unexpected shift in camp dynamics. The rigid separation between guards and prisoners had been eroding gradually since Christmas, but it was Sergeant Martinez who made the first formal gesture toward integration. He announced that the Sunday dinner on March 11th would be served family-style, with mixed seating and shared platters placed in the center of each table. Guards and prisoners would pass dishes to one another, serve each other, and eat together as if they were family members rather than captors and captives. The announcement created tension on both sides. Some American soldiers objected, arguing that such familiarity was inappropriate and possibly dangerous. A few German women worried that eating alongside their guards would be uncomfortable, that the forced proximity would highlight rather than bridge their differences. But Captain Chen supported Martinez's plan, and on that Sunday evening, everyone took their assigned seats at the newly arranged tables with visible apprehension. Marlene found herself seated between Private Wilson and another American soldier she didn't know well, a quiet man from Michigan named Corporal James Bennett. Across from her sat Greta and Anna, with Martinez at the head of the table. The platters arrived: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and coleslaw. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Martinez picked up the platter of chicken and offered it to Marlene with a gentle smile. She took a piece, passed the platter to Private Wilson, and the spell was broken. Food began circulating around the table. Private Wilson tried to compliment Greta's drawing skills in his halting German, making everyone laugh when he accidentally said she drew like a potato instead of beautifully. Corporal Bennett pulled out photographs of his 3 children back in Detroit, showing them proudly to Anna, who responded with stories about her younger siblings. The conversation was awkward and frequently punctuated by misunderstandings, but it was genuine. They were talking to each other as people rather than as abstractions defined by nationality or military status. Subsequent Sunday dinners followed the same pattern, and the quality of conversation improved as language barriers diminished and comfort levels increased. Marlene learned that Private Wilson's father had died when he was young, leaving him to help raise his 3 younger sisters. She shared her own story about losing her father in the bombing, and they found unexpected common ground in their grief. Greta discovered that Corporal Bennett loved classical music, particularly Beethoven, and they spent entire meals discussing their favorite compositions, communicating through humming melodies when words failed. These shared meals revealed what propaganda had obscured. The American soldiers weren't monsters or decadent weaklings. They were farmers' sons, factory workers, teachers, and shopkeepers who had been drafted into a war they hadn't started. The German women weren't fanatical Nazis or willing participants in atrocities. They were secretaries, nurses, and radio operators who had believed they were serving their country's legitimate defense. Both groups were caught in forces larger than themselves, and over plates of fried chicken and bowls of mashed potatoes, they recognized their shared humanity. Captain Chen's 40th birthday fell on March 28, 1945. His wife had sent a package from California containing family photographs and a letter describing their young son's progress in school. The letter left him homesick and melancholy, a rare emotional state for the usually composed officer. He shared none of this with his subordinates, maintaining the professional distance his rank required, but Marlene noticed his subdued demeanor during morning inspection. She approached Martinez later that day with a proposal. She wanted to bake a German chocolate cake for Captain Chen's birthday. not as a favor to curry advantage, but as a genuine expression of gratitude for his fairness and compassion over the past 4 months. Martinez understood the significance of her request. This wasn't about following orders or earning extra privileges. This was about giving something personal and meaningful to someone who had treated them with unexpected dignity. The recipe for authentic German chocolate cake required ingredients that weren't readily available, but Martinez proved resourceful. He traded favors with other camp kitchens, bartered with local suppliers, and even contributed some of his own rationed chocolate to ensure Marlene had everything she needed. Greta offered to make marzipan decorations. Anna volunteered to write a birthday message in careful English script on a card made from precious art paper Lieutenant Muller provided. Marlene spent the entire day before Captain Chen's birthday in the kitchen, working with an intensity of focus that transformed baking into meditation. She melted chocolate slowly, tempering it precisely. She separated eggs with practiced efficiency, whipping whites to perfect peaks. She layered the cake with chocolate buttercream, smoothing it with techniques her grandmother had taught her years ago in a Berlin kitchen that no longer existed. Every motion carried weight. Every decision mattered. This cake was an apology she couldn't speak aloud, gratitude she couldn't adequately express in her still imperfect English, and hope that one simple gesture might communicate what words could not. The presentation happened during evening formation. Captain Chen stood before the assembled prisoners and guards, preparing to deliver routine announcements, when Marlene stepped forward carrying the cake on a borrowed silver platter. The entire camp fell silent. She approached him with steady steps despite her trembling hands, stopped at the appropriate distance, and spoke in her careful English. "Captain Chen, today is your birthday. We know you are far from your family. We want you to know that we are grateful. This cake is our thank you." Captain Chen stared at the elaborate creation before him. 3 layers of dark chocolate cake, covered in glossy buttercream, decorated with delicate marzipan flowers that Greta had formed by hand. It was beautiful and clearly represented hours of skilled labor. His throat tightened unexpectedly as he recognized what this gesture meant. These women who had arrived 4 months ago, frightened and suspicious, who had every reason to hate their captors, had created something beautiful for him simply because they wanted to express gratitude. He accepted the cake with both hands, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you. This is the most thoughtful gift I have received in a very long time." That evening, the cake was shared among everyone at camp, guards and prisoners together, each slice representing a small victory over hatred and division. May 8, 1945 arrived with news that spread through Camp Swift like wildfire. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. American soldiers celebrated with cautious joy, knowing that the Pacific Theater still demanded their attention, but recognizing that this moment represented a turning point in history. For the German women prisoners, the announcement brought not celebration but profound uncertainty about what surrender meant for their futures and the futures of their families still in Germany. Marlene stood in the barracks holding a letter she had received just that morning from her mother. The letter was dated March 15th, nearly 2 months old, and the news it contained felt ominously relevant to the current moment. Her mother wrote that Russian forces were advancing from the east and American forces from the west. Berlin was being bombed around the clock. Food had become even scarcer than before. Her brother Klaus had not been heard from in weeks. The letter ended with words that haunted Marlene. "I no longer know if survival is victory or defeat. I no longer know what we are surviving for." The official announcement came during evening formation. Captain Chen's voice was measured and professional as he explained that repatriation procedures would begin immediately for German prisoners of war. Transportation would be arranged. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever homes still existed. The timeline was uncertain, but they should expect to leave Texas within the next 4 to 8 weeks. Greta stood beside Marlene, her face pale. "Return to what?" she whispered in German. "My family is dead or scattered. My city is ruins. What am I returning to?" Around them, other women were asking similar questions. Anna's hands shook as she contemplated going back to a Germany she no longer recognized, looking for family members who might not have survived. Elsa wrapped her arms around herself as if physically holding together pieces that threatened to fall apart. That night, sleep eluded most of the women. They gathered in small groups throughout the barracks, speaking in hushed German about their fears and uncertainties. Some expressed relief that their imprisonment was ending, eager to search for surviving family members despite the devastation. Others spoke with growing dread about returning to a country that had lost everything, including the ideology that had given their wartime service meaning. A few voiced the thought that others had been thinking but hadn't dared say aloud. What if staying in America was better than going home? The question hung in the air like smoke, controversial and impossible to ignore. Marlene finally spoke it plainly. "We have learned something here. We have learned that everything we were told was a lie. The Americans are not our enemies. They have treated us better than our own government treated our families. They have fed us while our mothers and brothers starved. They have taught us and trusted us and shown us a different way of being human." She paused, gathering courage for the most dangerous admission. "I do not want to go back to Germany. I want to stay here." The morning after Germany's surrender, Marlene woke before dawn with absolute clarity about what she needed to do. She had spent the entire night in conversation with Greta, Anna, and 9 other women who had reached the same shocking conclusion. They did not want to return to Germany, not immediately, perhaps not ever. The question was whether such a choice was even possible, and if so, how to request something so unprecedented without appearing ungrateful or disloyal to their defeated homeland. She asked for a private meeting with Captain Chen. He received her in his office, his expression curious and concerned. Marlene had rehearsed her speech in English, practicing every word until her accent was as minimal as she could make it. "Captain Chen, I come to you with a request that I know is unusual, maybe impossible, but I must ask." She took a breath and continued, 12 of us. We do not wish to return to Germany immediately. We wish to stay in America if this is permitted." Captain Chen leaned back in his chair, his face carefully neutral. "Miss Weber, you understand that you are prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention requires your repatriation. Your families are waiting for you. Your country, despite its defeat, is still your home." His words were gentle but firm, laying out the practical and legal obstacles to her request. Marlene had anticipated this response. "Captain, my father is dead. My brother is missing. My mother lives in a basement with strangers, eating potato peels and grass. If I return, I will be one more mouth she cannot feed, one more person suffering in a country that no longer exists as we knew it. Here, I have learned skills. I have learned English. I have learned that I can work and contribute and become something more than I was." Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed forward. "More than this, Captain, I have learned what America truly means. Not the propaganda we were taught, but the real thing, the kindness, the abundance, the possibility that people can change and be forgiven and start again." The other 11 women had requested to be present for the official petition. They stood in Captain Chen's office that afternoon, presenting their case collectively. Greta explained that her entire family was dead or disappeared. Anna spoke about her fear of returning to a country where women who had served the Wehrmacht might face retribution from both occupying forces and their own countrymen. Elsa, always the most articulate, made the moral argument. "We were part of something terrible, even if we did not know. How terrible at the time. Going back to Germany feels like running away from the knowledge we have gained here. Staying in America feels like accepting responsibility to become better people." Captain Chen listened to each woman's story, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment, Finally, he spoke with characteristic honesty. "What you are asking is unprecedented. I have never heard of prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. The legal implications alone are staggering, but I understand your reasoning and I will forward your request to my superiors in Washington with my full support." Captain Chen's report to Washington created unexpected ripples throughout Central Texas. The story of 12 German women prisoners requesting to remain in America rather than return home reached local newspapers within days. The Bastrop Advertiser ran a front-page article titled "Enemy Prisoners Choose America Over Homeland." The Austin American Statesman picked up the story, followed by papers in Houston and Dallas. What could have been a controversy instead sparked something remarkable across Texas communities. The first sponsor offer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, a widow who ran a small restaurant in Bastrop, wrote directly to Captain Chen. Her letter explained that her only son had been killed at Normandy and she had spent months consumed by hatred for all Germans. But reading about these young women, who had discovered the truth about their own country's evil and chosen to embrace American values instead, had moved her deeply. She offered to sponsor Marlene specifically, providing housing and employment at her restaurant if permission was granted. Within a week, Captain Chen's office was flooded with similar letters. A farming family in nearby Elgin offered to sponsor Greta, needing help with their dairy operation and willing to teach her the business. A hospital in Austin expressed interest in sponsoring Anna, who had demonstrated nursing aptitude during her imprisonment. The Henderson family, who had been visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program, offered to sponsor 2 women. Local businesses, church groups, and individual families stepped forward with housing offers, job opportunities, and promises of support. The response wasn't universally positive. Some veterans organizations protested, arguing that German prisoners should not receive special treatment, while American soldiers were still fighting in the Pacific. Angry letters appeared in newspaper editorial sections, questioning whether enemy nationals could ever truly become loyal Americans. A few local residents organized a small protest outside Camp Swift, carrying signs demanding that all German prisoners be sent home immediately without exception. But the supporters outnumbered the critics. Reverend Thomas Mitchell of First Baptist Church in Bastrop organized a coalition of religious leaders who wrote a joint letter to the War Department endorsing the women's request. They argued that showing mercy and offering redemption was fundamentally American, reflecting the nation's highest values rather than contradicting them. Local business owners pointed out that Texas would need workers in the post-war economy, and these women had already demonstrated skills, work ethic, and genuine desire to contribute. Martinez became an unofficial advocate, writing his own letter to military authorities describing the women's transformation over 6 months. He detailed their work in the kitchen, their language acquisition, their genuine remorse about their country's actions, and their sincere desire to build new lives based on American principles. Private Wilson and several other guards added their endorsements, testifying to the women's character and their successful integration into camp life. Lieutenant Muller provided perhaps the most compelling testimony. As someone who had fled Germany in 1933, she understood what it meant to choose America over homeland. Her report emphasized that these women represented exactly the kind of Germans who could help build a better post-war world, people who had confronted uncomfortable truths and chosen growth over denial. June 20th, 1945, arrived with bittersweet finality. The response from Washington had come 3 weeks earlier, delivered in characteristically bureaucratic language that nonetheless represented a remarkable victory. The 12 women who had requested to stay would be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. They would be released into the sponsorship of approved American families and organizations, with the possibility of eventual immigration status pending security clearances and continued good behavior. The remaining 16 women who had chosen repatriation would leave for Europe the following morning. Martinez had spent 2 days preparing a farewell dinner that would honor both groups. He combined German and American dishes on a menu that represented the culinary journey everyone had taken together. The main course was his famous Texas chili alongside traditional German sauerbraten. Side dishes included cornbread and spätzle, coleslaw and red cabbage, black-eyed peas, and potato salad. For dessert, he had made both pecan pie and the apple strudel that Greta had taught him to prepare 3 months earlier. The mess hall had been decorated with flowers from the camp garden that several women had cultivated during spring months. Someone had fashioned a banner reading "Safe Travels" and "New Beginnings" in both English and German. Tables were arranged in one large square so everyone could see each other, guards and prisoners together for this final shared meal. Captain Chen had authorized wine for the occasion, a single glass for each person, enough to toast, but not enough to diminish the solemnity of the moment. As everyone took their seats, Marlene stood to speak. She had been chosen by both groups to deliver remarks because her English had become fluent enough to express complex emotions. She spoke slowly, her accent still present, but her words clear and heartfelt. 6 months ago, we arrived at this place as enemies. We expected cruelty and received kindness. We expected punishment and received education. We expected to remain enemies and instead became something we never imagined possible. We became friends. She paused, gathering her composure before continuing. Those of us who are staying are not abandoning Germany or running from responsibility. We are choosing to carry forward what we have learned here. We are choosing to build lives that honor the mercy we have been shown. Those who are returning to Germany carry the same lessons. They will rebuild our country with the knowledge that former enemies can become partners in peace. Both choices are difficult. Both require courage. Both serve the future rather than the past. Greta stood next, speaking in German that Lieutenant Mueller translated. We came here believing America was our enemy. We learned that our real enemy was ignorance and hatred. We will never forget what happened in this camp, how food and kindness broke down walls that propaganda had built. Whether we stay or go, we carry these memories as sacred treasures. The meal was eaten slowly, with long pauses for conversation and many tears. Women who were staying exchanged addresses with those who were leaving, promising to write and maintain connections. American guards who had formed friendships with specific prisoners gave small gifts. Private Wilson presented Marlene with a small American flag he had carried in his pocket since basic training. 3 years after that final dinner at Camp Swift, Marlene Weber stood in the kitchen of Patterson's restaurant in downtown Bastrop, reviewing the evening menu. She had become Mrs. Dorothy Patterson's partner in the business, managing daily operations while Dorothy focused on community relationships and expansion plans. The restaurant had grown from a modest diner into one of the most popular establishments in Central Texas, famous for its unique fusion of German and American cuisine. The menu reflected Marlene's journey. German potato pancakes were served alongside Texas-style hash browns. Sauerbraten appeared next to chicken fried steak. The restaurant's signature dish was something Marlene had invented herself, a combination of German spätzle with Texas chili that sounded strange but tasted remarkable. Food critics from Austin wrote appreciative reviews. Local residents brought visiting family members to experience the unusual but delicious combinations. Greta had found similar success on the dairy farm in Elgin. She had learned every aspect of the operation and eventually married the family's youngest son, Robert, a gentleman who had returned from the Pacific with shrapnel, wounds, and recurring nightmares. Their relationship had been built slowly on shared work and mutual respect, and their wedding the previous summer had been attended by dozens of former Camp Swift personnel, both American guards and German former prisoners. Anna had completed her nursing certification at Austin's Brackenridge Hospital and was now head nurse of the pediatric ward. She had never married, instead dedicating herself to caring for sick children. With an intensity that her colleagues recognized as both professional excellence and personal mission. She often said that every child she helped heal felt like a small repayment of the debt she owed to the country that had given her a second chance. The other 9 women who had stayed had similarly found their paths to contribution and belonging. 2 had married American soldiers they met during their imprisonment. 1 had opened a bakery in San Antonio specializing in German breads and pastries. Another had become a translator for the State Department, helping process the thousands of displaced persons arriving from devastated Europe. Each had built a life that honored the transformation they had experienced over cornbread and chili in a Texas prisoner of war camp. Letters arrived regularly from Germany, from the women who had chosen repatriation. Their stories were harder, but no less meaningful. They wrote about the challenges of rebuilding homes and lives in occupied zones, about searching for lost family members, about the daily struggle of survival in a country that had lost everything. But they also wrote about hope, about small victories, about the gradual emergence of a new Germany that rejected the ideology that had led to such devastation. Several of the women who had returned had become leaders in German-American friendship societies, working to strengthen bonds between former enemies. They carried with them stories of the kindness they had experienced in Texas, using those stories to convince other Germans that reconciliation was possible and necessary. 1975, 30 years after the war's end. Marlene Weber Patterson sat in her comfortable living room in Bastrop, watching her daughter Sarah arrange a tape recorder on the coffee table between them. Sarah was 24 years old, a graduate student at the University of Texas, working on her master's thesis about displaced persons and post-war immigration. She had grown up hearing fragments of her mother's story, but had never asked for the complete narrative until now. "Mom," Sarah began, her finger poised over the record button, "tell me about the cornbread." It was a strange way to begin an oral history interview, but Sarah had learned from her preliminary research that food had played a crucial role in her mother's transformation from enemy prisoner to American citizen. Marlene smiled at the question, recognizing its wisdom. Everything important in her story could be traced back to that first meal. "The cornbread was golden," Marlene began, her accent still present after 3 decades, but softened by years of speaking English daily. "It was warm and slightly sweet, and nothing like any bread I had ever eaten in Germany. I took one bite and I started to cry because I realized that everything I had been told about America was a lie. You see, Sarah, I had been taught that Americans were cruel, that they would torture prisoners and starve us. Instead, they gave me cornbread and chili, more food than I had seen in months, and they gave it freely without cruelty or mockery." She paused, gathering memories that were still vivid despite the passage of time. But it wasn't just the food itself. It was what the food represented. In Germany, we had been taught that strength came from hardness, from discipline, from denying weakness. The Nazis told us that compassion was weakness, and that feeding your enemies was foolish. But Sergeant Martinez, he showed me something different. He showed me that real strength comes from generosity, that you can be powerful enough to show mercy to those who cannot repay you. Sarah listened intently as her mother described the months at Camp Swift, the gradual transformation from frightened prisoner to confident contributor, the relationships built over shared meals, the recipe book that had become a symbol of cultural exchange. Marlene pulled out her original copy, the pages yellowed and stained from decades of use, still containing Greta's beautiful drawings and annotations in both German and English. "When I teach you to cook," Marlene said, her voice thick with emotion, "I am not just teaching you recipes, I am teaching you history. Every time you make cornbread, you remember that food can bridge divides between enemies. Every time you make spätzle, you remember that culture is something you carry with you even when you leave your homeland. Every time you combine them in ways that seem strange but work beautifully, you remember that different traditions can create something better together than either could alone.